Let me ask you this honestly. Do you think that there is anything in the world, anything at all, that Frank Turek actually knows? Or is it all things that he's just convinced he knows because he has blind and absurd faith? Because I think we're about to find out. I know I keep doing these stupid Frank Turek videos, sometimes because I find one that I want to look at, and sometimes because I stumble into it. But the one thing I can rely on is the fact that Frank will never make sense. Not once, not ever. Everything that comes out of his mouth is run through his ridiculous religious delusion filter, and that makes no sense whatsoever when it finally hits the airwaves. It's why his videos are so simple to debunk, because Frank himself is simple. Simple-minded, I guess. So let's see what he has to say about morality, and why, at the end of the day, all he ever does is make us roll our eyes.
In fact, in my couple of debates with Michael Shermer, he kept saying, how do you know murder's wrong? I said, Michael, we both agree murder's wrong.
Except you do so for different reasons. Michael Shermer understands the nuance and Frank Turek does not. That's really where these discussions go south, because the religious don't really understand what their beliefs imply. They simply believe because it says so in a book of ancient mythology, whereas Shermer, I would assume without having gone to check it out, understands why people actually consider murder to be wrong. It is a matter of intellect, not faith. When it's left to faith, you get theists rationalizing who they get to murder for what reasons, not murder is wrong, full stop, for everyone, all the time. But I guess when you follow one of the biggest mass murderers of history, you really don't understand the difference.
I can justify why it is, you can't.
No, you can assert why it is. That's not the same thing as being able to justify it. What Christians do, and we'll talk about Christians for the moment because we are addressing Frank Turek, but Christians are taking claims from on high, or claims that they are claims from on high, seriously. They have never personally considered if these claims are worthwhile or if the claims are objectively valid in the first place. God said it, they believe it, and that settles it. Except they've never proven that God said a thing or exists in the first place. They don't understand how to do the hard philosophical work required to come to a rational and intellectually valid conclusion. They're just parroting what it says in a book, or more accurately, what they personally interpret what that book says.
One of the things that I get stuck with when I'm in a debate, I'm always debating with the objective moral argument. And we'll argue for a while, and I'll tell them, well, when it comes down to it, if God does not exist, then murder isn't really wrong.
Which is nonsense. But this is what happens when you're just following ancient mythology without thinking about it at all. So let's actually look at this. Why is murder wrong? Is it because your magical sky daddy said that it is? Or is it because humans who actually exist have decided that it's unacceptable? Now, keep in mind that only one of those things are actually demonstrably real. But the religious, well, they just want simple to follow, easy to understand moral dictates that they just don't have to think about, and they don't have to work through. So everything is black and white, and where anything drifts into gray, well, they just wave their hands and ignore it. Was God a moral monster for murdering virtually everyone on the planet in a flood? Well, their morality would seem to demand yes, but because it's God, God can get away with murder, literally. They can spin their narrative to mean absolutely anything that they want it to mean. It's why, as usual, these discussions with the religious go absolutely nowhere productive.
And then the atheist will say, yeah, like they say that's my worldview. That's what I believe in. Murder really isn't wrong.
I bet that's not what a single atheist has ever said. We simply acknowledge that it isn't as cut and dried as you'd like to think that it is. Morality, whether the religious like it or not, is based on two things: empathy, the ability to put yourself into the shoes of another person and understand how it would feel if things happened to you, and enlightened self-interest, the natural understanding that because we would like to be treated a certain way, that we ought to treat others that way in hopes that they will reciprocate. Therefore, in most cultures, because we don't want to be murdered, we don't permit others to murder either. That's all there is to the question, but surprise, surprise, the religious can't get that through their thick little heads because acknowledging reality, well, that's hard.
How can I deal with something like that?
You can listen to what's actually being said to you instead of trying to reframe it into Christian terms. You can understand that there is nuance and context here, and that everything isn't black and white. I know that's difficult for your immature little mind to grasp, but at least try. Unfortunately, a lot of people never reach that level of maturity. Frank here, for instance, is one of them. So, let's watch him fall apart.
You're lying.
Sure they are. Well, someone here is at least. In the thousands of religious debates that I have engaged in and observed in my life, I have never, ever seen an atheist say that there's nothing wrong with murder. They just understand that it isn't some all-encompassing universal prohibition that goes for everyone whether they like it or not. If that was the case, we wouldn't have murderers, would we? Which is clearly not true. But leave it to Frank to be stupid right out of the gate.
He already knows it's wrong.
Because Frank can read the mind of everyone on the planet, apparently. Yeah, when you're out of your freaking mind like Frank is, it's no surprise what kind of nonsense comes out of your mouth.
He is. He knows it's wrong. You can't convince somebody to know something he already knows.
Right.
In fact, my friend Jay Bujashevsky, who teaches at UT Austin, has written a wonderful book called What We Can't Not Know about this very topic. Says, and he's a professor there, he says, I used to, when students would come to me and say, well, how do we even know murder's wrong? He used to try and convince them murder's wrong, and he finally says, I don't do that anymore. They already know it's wrong. I just say, you don't have any doubt that murder's wrong now, do you? Really?
Because he has absolutely no understanding of the subject matter whatsoever. So he just declares victory, and it's no surprise that Frank tries the same thing. It's like walking up to a Christian and saying, you don't really believe this God stuff, and thinking that you've somehow won the argument. You don't get to tell other people what they do and do not believe. This professor guy simply has no intelligent response, so he refuses to engage intelligently at all. Because what else is new?
No. But it's not just knowing it's wrong. The point is, there's a standard beyond us that we know.
Really? Says who? Because this is pretty typical Frank as well. Just declare victory and decide out of the blue that everyone actually agrees with you, because he simply can't get it through his head that lots of people think he's nuts. It's ultimately childish. What he's really doing here is saying, well, I'm right, so there. And if you tell him that he's full of crap, he'll just call you a liar. I mean, what else can he do?
And that knowing that standard is why we know it's wrong.
You know things if and only if you actually know them. Of course, religion doesn't really know anything. It simply asserts things and then demands that those things had to have been right all along because, feelings. It's why they don't have a clue what knowledge actually is. They think that so long as they believe something really, really, really hard, that makes it knowledge, and that's simply not the case. It's why I point out the difference between reason and rationalization. One is valid for achieving knowledge. The other is not. Guess which one Frank uses.
So this is not a question of what we call epistemology. That's a fancy word for how we know things. Mm-hmm. It's a question of ontology. This standard, why does that standard exist? If that standard doesn't exist, then you can't justify saying murder is wrong.
Proof that it does. Just because you wish it existed, just because you believe it exists, you have not demonstrated that it actually exists at all. But this is why the religious go absolutely nowhere in any kind of objectively demonstrable debate. We ask for evidence, and they can never go beyond, we really, really, really like our book, so there.
You can know it's wrong, and atheists will say, I know right and wrong, to which I'll say, yeah, I know you know right and wrong.
Yeah, we're the ones vastly underrepresented in prison population entry statistics. We know right and wrong a lot more than you do. Maybe you ought to ask yourself why, but let's be honest, Frank never will.
But you can't justify why murder's wrong, because if there is no God, everything's just a matter of opinion.
Right.
You say that like it matters, because ultimately, all of this is just a matter of opinion. There are no black and white, universally applicable moral laws, no matter how much you desperately wish that there were. That's the point. We can have a superior morality to yours without all of the religious debris that you insist on dragging around behind you. You fundamentally misunderstand how morality works, which is why you find a lot more religious criminals than you do atheists. Funny how that works, isn't it?
So it's the difference between epistemology and ontology. And normally atheists want to argue over epistemology. In fact, in my couple of debates with Michael Shermer, he kept saying, how do you know murder's wrong? I said, Michael, we both agree murder's wrong.
And we're right back to this again. I've already responded, so I'm not going to do it again. The only thing I think we can all agree on is that Frank Turek is an idiot. Let's leave it at that. Honestly, I can't say that any of this surprises me at all, not just coming from Frank, although he is the irrational gift that keeps on giving, but from pretty much any apologist. It seems they just don't understand how, much of anything actually works. They examine the world through a religious lens first, and then they try to fit everything else in around their beliefs. It's why they get absolutely everything wrong. Frank is just one of those people who are just so laughably, blatantly obvious in their biases that it's hard to mistake anything he says for rational thought. He hasn't got a clue about anything, although I'm sure he thinks he does. So much so that he thinks he can just tell the opposition what they think, so he doesn't have to actually deal with the reality of their disagreement. Because nobody actually disagrees with Frank, don't you know? They can't. It would destroy his view of the world if anyone actually thought Frank was wrong. So, according to Frank, they don't. His detractors are just lying. It must be true because, Frank says so. But Frank is a moron, so I'm not sure that really means anything. What do you think? Let me know in the comments.
bum,